What's gaming, gamers? Today I've got a hunter build guide for you using the new hunter exotic arms armor Mothkeeper's wraps along with the new seasonal exotic weapon Diris. This build will make you feel like you're a Lucent Hive Knight using the Arc Boomer weapon and Lucent Moths to crowd control and dispatch groups of enemies with ease. Before I get into the build, however, I'd like to shout out our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs. If you're looking for people to play any content in Destiny with, ranging from ritual playlist and seasonal activities all the way to raids and Grandmaster strikes, feel free to join the Discord server. We welcome anyone no matter how new or seasoned you are, and all of us will teach encounters if you don't know something. If anything I've said has piqued your interest, hop into the server and play some Destiny with us, the link is in the description. Now, if you aren't aware of what the Mothkeeper's wraps do, I'll explain what exactly that is now. Mothkeeper's wraps have the exotic perk Winged Eclipse. Winged Eclipse replaces your arc grenade ability with 2 cages of loyal moths. Upon impact with either an enemy or a surface, the cage of loyal moths will deploy 2 Lucent Moths, who will target the nearest ally or enemy depending on which is closer to the location of the impact of the grenade. Moths that target allies will glow purple and fly towards those allies, granting them a 22.5 HP Void Overshield upon reaching that ally. Moths that target enemies will glow blue, and upon reaching the enemy they've targeted, they will explode, dealing damage and blinding enemies within a 4-meter radius of the explosion. Damage caused by the Arc Moths do count as grenade damage for the purposes of subclass elements and armor mods. Now that you're aware of what the Mothkeeper's wraps do, I'll get into a subclass build to use for this build. These arms don't require a specific subclass, but the Diris exotic grenade launcher's catalyst will amplify you, making the Arc subclass an easy choice for this build. I'll start by putting a prescriptive subclass build on screen, and once I've done that, I'll go over everything in more detail, describing what each element does, why I've chosen it, as well as any alternative options should there be any. For your super, run Gathering Storm. Run the Gambler's Dodge, whichever jump you prefer, the Disorienting Blow melee, any one of the grenades, the Flow State aspect, the Lethal Current aspect, Spark of Beacons, Spark of Brilliance, Spark of Discharge, and Spark of Shock. To detail the subclass, firstly the super. I prefer to run this build with Gathering Storm as it will help with boss damage specifically. This build is perfectly designed for ad clearing and crowd controlling groups of ads with the blind effect, so I feel running the Arcstaff super for ad clearing just isn't necessary. And without the Raid and Flux chest piece, Arcstaff isn't the best boss damaging super. That leaves Gathering Storm as the clear choice for me, although you can run Arcstaff if you prefer it. For the dodge, I choose to run the Gambler's Dodge, as in combination with the Disorienting Blow melee, it will grant you a high uptime on blinding targets with your melee ability. You could run the Marksman's Dodge, but as the Diris grenade launcher reloads itself, I don't find Marksman's to be necessary for this build. For the melee ability itself, as I've said, Disorienting Blow will allow you to blind targets who have gotten a bit too close to you quickly and easily. It does have a significant base cooldown, but with the Gambler's Dodge equipped, Disorienting Blow's cooldown is effectively that of the Gambler's Dodge, which increases Disorienting Blow's uptime significantly. You can run the Combination Blow melee instead, but I don't like to run it without the protection granted by Assassin's Cowl, or the damage buff from Liar's Handshake, as it's risky to use without either of those exotics in higher difficulty content. You shouldn't really be using the melee ability actively with this build anyways. Disorienting Blow is simply a defensive tool to use on a Cabal Gladiator or Scorn Wraith who's charged you. Onto your grenade, it doesn't matter which you run at all. Mothkeeper's wraps doesn't let you throw a normal grenade, and it overwrites the base cooldown of whichever grenade you choose to 73 seconds, so the specific grenade you choose has no effect on the build itself. For the first aspect, Flow State is the one to choose. Flow State will instantly grant you the Amplified buff upon defeating any jolted target, which is a decent source of Amplified if you don't have Diris' Catalyst complete. Where Flow State shines with this build, however, is the buffs it grants while Amplified. These are a 200% increase to your class ability's recharge rate, plus 50 to the reload speed stat of any weapon you wield, and an extra 66% damage resistance to incoming damage while in your dodge animation. Onto the second aspect, Lethal Current is chosen as I find it to be simply less useless with this build than Tempest Strike. As this build isn't a melee build, neither Lethal Current nor Tempest Strike are really great, but Lethal Current will still provide buffs to your melee ability so long as you've used it shortly after having used your dodge ability. As for the fragments, the first one to choose is Spark of Beacons. Spark of Beacons will cause any final blow dealt by an arc special weapon while amplified to create a blinding explosion, blinding any targets nearby to the one killed. This is perfect with Diris as it is an arc special weapon and will benefit greatly from this fragment. The second fragment to bring is Spark of Brilliance. Spark of Brilliance is mostly useful when your Diris is out of ammo and you're using any weapon that is capable of dealing precision damage. As the Moths summoned by the Mothkeeper's wraps will blind targets, defeating those blinded targets with precision damage will cause a blinding explosion similar to the one caused by Spark of Beacons without requiring you to be amplified first. Furthermore, Spark of Brilliance adds 10 points to your intellect stat, which will help you build your super that much quicker. The third fragment to use is Spark of Discharge. Spark of Discharge will cause your arc weapon kills to progress a hidden counter that upon reaching 100% will summon an Ionic Trace. The specific amount that hidden counter is progressed depends on the tier of enemy killed with the weapon, but on average you'll be generating an Ionic Trace once every third kill. Spark of Discharge does lower your strength stat by 10 points, but as this build isn't specifically a melee build, that's not a significant detriment. Additionally, the Ionic Trace summoned will more than make up for the loss in base regeneration upon its collection. Lastly, for fragments, Spark of Shock will cause your grenades to jolt targets when damaging them. This does work with Mothkeeper's wraps, and the Arc Moths summoned by the grenade specifically will jolt targets damaged by them. This is a great source of amplified if you find yourself out of ammo for Diris, as due to the flow state aspect, killing any jolted target will instantly amplify you. Spark of Shock does lower your discipline stat by 10 points, but that's a small price to pay for the extra damage granted by the jolt, and instant source of amplified granted by the fragment. As for any alternative fragments, Spark of Resistance can be good if you find yourself diving into groups of enemies or getting swarmed by enemies frequently, as it will grant you a 25% damage resistance when within 15 meters of 3 or more enemies. This is especially helpful with Diris, as it deals a decent amount of damage to you if you shoot it too close to you. I didn't choose this fragment as it's somewhat situational, and any Void Moth summoned via your Mothkeeper's wraps or your Diris will seek you out and grant you an Overshield, which is simply a slightly less effective Spark of Resistance. Another fragment that can be helpful is Spark of Recharge. Spark of Recharge will grant you an additional 400% increase to your grenade and melee abilities base recharge rate while at critical health. Obviously you don't want to be at critical health, but as this build makes significant use of the grenade ability, and the fact that throwing the grenade at your feet will grant you an Overshield via the Void Moth summoned, this can be a very nice passive fragment for regenerating your grenade and melee abilities faster while you regenerate health. Now I'll get into some artifact mods that can help with this build's efficacy if you're playing during Season 22, the Season of the Witch. In my opinion, the artifact this season is pretty tame, so instead of going over the entire artifact as I would have in the past, I'll simply detail a few specific mods I recommend you use with this build. If you'd prefer I go over the entire artifact in the future, let me know in the comments and I can return to doing it that way. Firstly, in the second column is the Diviner's Discount mod. Diviner's Discount will lower the cost of all scavenger mods on your legs to a cost of 1 energy, which will allow you to slot more mods into your armor. This is beneficial for this build, as a lot of its effectiveness comes from having ammo for Diris and will be taken advantage of when I get to the armor's mod setup. Next, the Arc Elemental Orbs mod in the third column of the artifact will cause arc weapon kills to progress a hidden counter that upon reaching 100% will summon an Arc Elemental Orb. When thrown, this Arc Orb will jolt targets damaged by the orb's explosion, which will both amplify you via the flow state aspect as well as simply help you deal that little bit more damage to higher health targets. Next, in the fifth column, the Monochromatic Maelstrom mod will grant you damage buffs to your weapons and abilities upon dealing matching elemental damage of the opposite type. What that means for this build is upon dealing arc weapon damage, your abilities will be granted a 10% increase to their damage for 5 seconds. Subsequently, upon dealing arc ability damage, your arc weapons will be granted a similar 10% increase to their damage for 5 seconds. The buff isn't refreshable while active, but it has no cooldown, meaning it can be instantly reapplied once its timer has decayed. Lastly, for artifact mods, in the fifth column, the Elemental Embrace mod will grant you 50 points to your recovery stat, as well as a 50% damage resistance to incoming arc damage while amplified. This mod is mostly chosen for the 50 recovery points, as that's an incredibly beneficial stat to have high points in. As this build's amplified uptime is near 100%, you'll have this 50-point stat boost to recovery nearly 100% of the time as well, leading to much further increased survivability. It does somewhat clash with the Spark of Recharge fragment if you chose to bring that, as having nearly maxed out recovery will decrease the amount of time spent at critical health significantly, so keep that in mind if you decide to use Spark of Recharge. The 50% damage resistance to incoming arc damage while amplified is also a nice bonus, especially in activities with an active arc threat. With the artifact now done, I'll get into my recommendations for stat distribution when running this build. In the top 3 stat grouping of Mobility, Resilience, and Recovery, spec into Resilience first with Recovery and Mobility as secondary options. This season, with the Elemental Embrace mod, you can afford to forego some points in the Recovery stat in favor of ones in the Mobility stat, but this build will use the Dodge ability to some use, so having a decent Mobility stat is nice. In the bottom 3 stat grouping of Discipline, Intellect, and Strength, spec into Discipline first with Intellect and Strength as secondary stats. Discipline will be the most important stat, as it will dictate your grenade's base cooldown. Yes, Discipline does have an effect on the overridden Mothkeeper's wraps cooldown, so having a higher Discipline stat lets your grenades recharge passively that much faster. You can afford to spec into Strength a bit more than Intellect, as this build will generate a decent amount of Orbs of Power, which will offset a lower Intellect stat's passive and active super regeneration rate. My armor stats have me at 50 Mobility, 90 Resilience, 61 Recovery, 83 Discipline, 32 Intellect, and 50 Strength. Now that the armor stats are done, I'll get into the armor mod setup I recommend for this build. I'll put everything I use on screen first as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer, and then I'll detail why I've chosen everything I have. I'll then describe any alternative mod options should there be any. On your helmet, run a Harmonic Siphon mod, a Siphon mod that corresponds with your kinetic slot weapon's affinity, and a special ammo finder mod. On your arms, run as many grenade kickstart mods as you can fit. On your chest piece, simply run whichever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running. On your legs, run one Arc Scavenger mod, one Innervation mod, and one Recuperation mod. On your cloak, run one Bomber mod, one Powerful Attraction mod, and one Reaper mod. For the helmet's mods, the Harmonic Siphon mod will cause an Orb of Power to be summoned upon getting multi-kills with any arc weapon. Orbs of Power will do many things for this build, so generating them is important. If you're running a strand weapon in your kinetic slot, you can use the Arc Strand Siphon mod in the Seasonal Artifact and use that to save an energy slot, in which you can slot a Harmonic Siphon mod. This will generate more powerful orbs with arc weapons and normal orbs with strand weapons. Otherwise, simply run a Harmonic Siphon to allow your Diris to generate orbs, and run either a Kinetic or Stasis Siphon to allow your kinetic weapon to also generate orbs when you're out of Diris ammo. The Special Ammo Finder will simply work to help generate more special ammo for your Diris, ensuring it has ammo more frequently, keeping the uptime of your moths at their max potential. Onto the arms mods, grenade kickstarts are used here to simply increase the uptime on your grenades as significantly as possible. Grenade kickstarts work in combination with stacks of armor charge to refund you grenade energy upon the use of your grenade ability. On screen, you're seeing a screenshot from the Destiny Data Compendium describing the grenade kickstart mod. The numbers in blue are the numbers that are relevant to us, as they are the numbers that correspond to PvE energy refunds. As you can see, even without any stacks of armor charge, grenade kickstart mods act themselves as stacks of armor charge for the purposes of their specific kickstart. This means that, even if you have 0 stacks of armor charge, having 2 grenade kickstart mods equipped will still refund you 17.15% grenade ability energy upon the use of your grenade. Any additional stacks of armor charge will increase the amount of grenade energy refunded up to 37.8% grenade ability energy if you have 2 grenade kickstart mods slotted and 3 stacks of armor charge at the time of the use of your grenade. As my armor build allows me to slot 3 grenade kickstart mods without losing out on stats, I have an effective maximum refunded energy of 42.5%. But that 4.7% energy is negligible when taking into account Ionic Traces and Orb of Power ability energy gains, so don't feel as if you must have 3 grenade kickstart mods active. For your chest pieces mods, simply run whichever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running. I generally swap to 2 elemental resistance mods that correspond with the activity's threat modifier and a concussive dampener alongside it, but it's up to you how you want to run your resistance mods. You could run an Arc Reserves mod here as well, but I don't see that being as beneficial in higher difficulty content as resistance mods. Similarly, you can run a Charged Up mod, but again, I don't find the slight increase to refunded grenade ability energy worthwhile over the increased survivability granted by resistance mods. Onto your legs, firstly, the Arc Scavenger mod will grant you an additional 3 to 5% ammo for arc weapons when picking up an ammo brick. This works with ammo finder bricks and will always grant a minimum of 1 extra ammo even if 3 to 5% of the initial ammo count granted by the brick would be below 1 ammo. This is helpful for this build, as Diris is the centerpiece of the weapon loadout, and ensuring it has ammo more frequently is beneficial to the build. Scavenger mods don't stack, so there's no reason to run more than 1 on your legs. Next, the Innervation mod will grant you 10% grenade ability energy upon the collection of any Orb of Power, which is one reason why picking up Orbs of Power is important for this build. This will keep your grenade active much more often, which keeps this build doing what it's designed to do significantly more often. Lastly, the Recuperation mod will grant you 70 health upon the collection of any Orb of Power, which is very strong for survivability. This mod is a mainstay in almost every single one of my builds and will effectively ensure your survival so long as you're generating and collecting Orbs of Power. If you don't feel as if the Arc Scavenger mod is of use to you, you can swap it out for an Elemental Charge mod. Elemental Charge mods will cause every 3rd Ionic Trace collected to grant you a stack of armor charge, which will help your overall grenade ability uptime, especially if you're having a hard time generating and or collecting Orbs of Power. Lastly, for your cloak, the Bomber mod will grant you 10% grenade ability energy upon the use of your dodge ability. This will be quite helpful for your grenade's uptime, and if you use your dodge ability on cooldown, its additional ability energy is very noticeable over the duration of longer encounters. To add to the dodge's utility, the Powerful Attraction mod will cause any Orb of Power nearby you to be collected upon the use of your dodge ability. This will increase your stacks of armor charge, grant you grenade ability energy via the Innervation mod, and heal you via the Recuperation mod. I find this to be especially helpful when in the midst of multiple enemies, as they have a tendency to body block you and prevent you from collecting Orbs of Power you've created. Lastly, the Reaper mod will cause your next weapon final blow after having used your class ability to summon an Orb of Power, which will grant you all of the aforementioned buffs upon collection. This is simply a free Orb of Power, especially as, with the Bomber mod, you'll be using your class ability very frequently to take advantage of its ability energy gains. With the armor build now done, I'll get into a weapon loadout I recommend for this build. But before I do that, I'll describe what the Diris grenade launcher does and why it's the best choice for use with this build. Diris has the exotic perk Corrupted Nucleosynthesis, which grants it the ability to build up a resource called Enrage by either dealing or receiving damage. Enrage goes up by 25% per hit and decays from 100% in a total of 9.5 seconds. Upon reaching critical health, Enrage is instantly charged to its maximum of 100%, and while at critical health, Enrage doesn't decay at all. At 100% Enrage, the fire rate delay between shots is reduced to 0.7 times its base fire rate delay, effectively allowing the gun to shoot 30% faster. Diris' exotic trait, however, is where it synergizes significantly with this build. Its trait, Loyal Moths, will cause a loyal Arc Moth to be summoned upon getting a kill with the weapon, seeking out the nearest enemy and exploding at its location, damaging and blinding the enemy. While you have the Mothkeeper's wraps equipped, kills with Diris will summon both an Arc Moth and a Void Moth, which will seek out the nearest ally and grant them a 22.5 HP overshield. Diris' Catalyst causes kills with the weapon to instantly amplify you, and damaging enemies with the weapon grants 50% Enrage instead of its base 25%. Diris' exotic trait is the reason this weapon is brought specifically, as it synergizes perfectly with the Mothkeeper's wraps exotic arms. As for weapons in your kinetic slot, I prefer running a primary weapon in this slot, as double special has been nerfed and no longer causes an increased amount of heavy ammo to drop. This isn't to say double special loadouts are completely useless, but I much prefer having a primary weapon to fall back on in higher difficulty content especially. As for what weapon you run, it's entirely up to you. I'll generally run either an auto rifle or a submachine gun, but you can run a bow or a scout rifle just fine as well. The perk Demolitionist will help a great deal in keeping your grenade ability charged, so if you have any weapon with that perk, it is a great choice in the kinetic slot. The same goes for heavy weapons really, it's entirely up to you what you decide to run. Machine guns will give you a bit more stopping power against major enemies when you're out of ammo for your Diris, but that comes at the cost of boss damage. Rocket launchers and linear fusions are perfect for boss damage, but if you're out of ammo for your Diris, it may not be efficient to use heavy ammo on a major and you'll be stuck plinking at it with a primary ammo weapon. I generally run a rocket launcher, as the Moth grenades can and will help you deal with majors and champions quickly, but as I said, it's entirely your decision what heavy weapon to run. With the entire build now detailed, I'll explain a few tips I have for running this build in most content. Firstly, don't be afraid to use your Moth grenades. They are the build's primary source of crowd control with their blinding capabilities and will also serve to deal with adds effectively as they deal a decent chunk of damage. The Diris grenade launcher will deal with adds itself though, so I prefer to use the Moth grenades on major enemies and create Moth as the Diris by killing adds with it. Create and collect orbs of power to refund your grenade's energy, build stacks of armor charge and heal yourself by getting kills with your Diris and your kinetic slot weapon. Blind enemies that get too close to you with your disorienting blow melee ability, and remember that if you need a bit of extra protection, you can throw a Moth grenade at your feet to summon a Void Moth, which will seek you out and grant you a 22.5 HP overshield. But that's all for this video, thanks for watching! I'll be back next week with a Titan build guide. Also, I'll be streaming more frequently on Twitch over the next little while as I've got more time to do so. If you're interested in watching me grind seasonal activities and run dungeons and raids with the clan, feel free to stop by. The link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day!